So has Games Workshop found a way to nerf a codex before it's even out yet? Let's talk about the changes to Codex Tyranids, some of which are rather peculiar indeed. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd focus on the Tyranid section of the balanced dataslate and how the rules and the points changes are going to be affecting the Tyranids Codex that goes out on full sale this weekend. Prior to the Codex release, Index Tyranids hadn't been doing too badly as it went in Warhammer 40k. They had been managing to do a fairly impressive feat of around about a 50% win percentage in grand tournaments, and all of that despite other armies like Eldar, Custodes and Genestealer Cult out there, definitely showing that they were a faction with some teeth. I think that Index Tyranids definitely does have really quite a lot of solid units, though I do suspect that at least a little bit of that might be things like Biovore Spore Mines carrying them to very high scores. They are just a little bit excellent for farming out secondary points almost automatically. Of course though, now we have Codex Tyranids coming out this week. Basically it's in the weird situation where at time of recording it's basically on pre-order. Games Workshop has basically unveiled the contents last weekend, including all the points costs and things from the Codex. Technically though, the book doesn't really go live until this actual weekend, so it's a bit strange to be in the interim where you know what's in the book but it's not officially come out yet, and during this time Games Workshop drops a whole load of updates to the core game which does affect some Tyranid units and also changes all the points, so the ones in the Codex are basically defunct. It's quite a lot to get your head around, particularly with all the new detachments that Codex Tyranids is going to be throwing into the mix. I think that the Vanguard Onslaught one in particular looks quite good fun. With the points updates, basically where I had the first set from the Index, then we had the new set that came out with the Codex, which changed quite a few stuff. Broadly points went down more than up, though in the Codex it did have a QR code printed next to the points section, and basically tries to future-proof the Codex by saying that the points cost wouldn't be the official ones forever. You should use this QR code to go to the Minotaur and Field Manual on Warhammer Community, or use the points via the Warhammer 40k app. I must admit though, I wasn't expecting them to get overwritten quite as quickly as this. I thought we'd have a little bit of time with the new Codex points before Games Workshop decided to rebalance things. It is a bit odd to ship out a whole load of books with the points costs that are already invalidated by the time they go out. I feel like people might be a little bit more on board with it if the balance changes weren't quite so weird. I do feel that compared with quite a lot of the other factions in 40k, the Tyranids ones maybe haven't really been quite as good. A few quite powerful units nerfed, where I feel like in general the faction strength maybe wasn't massively ahead of other things, it's more the fact that they just score points really easily. And then just a few things that have been randomly nerfed that seemed like they had no reason to, things that were fairly well balanced, or just things that have been nerfed into the stratosphere. In any case, with points compared with the Codex, some things have gone down, some things have been reverted back to the index points, and some things have gone up quite a lot. Before we get into points changes though, I thought it might just be worth mentioning the core rules changes. A few of them do impact the Tyranids. The change of devastating wounds from mortal wounds to just ignoring armor and invulnerable saves is broadly not the worst thing for the Tyranids overall. They don't really have that many devastating wounds weapons with big damage characteristics. I guess it maybe is a small nerf to the Norn Emissary though, that has a feel no pain against mortal wounds only that dev wounds will now not trigger. If you're doing the objective thing with it though, then it will still get a 5+ feel no pain most of the time if it is on a midfield objective, so it's perhaps not the end of the world. Again, like several of the other codexes, I feel like the free stratagems change is perhaps one of the most impactful, really changing the role of a few of the units. Hive Tyrants have one of those copies of the free stratagem type rule. They're locked to just using battle tactics now. Fortunately though, the Invasion Fleet 5+ Feel No Pain one is a battle tactic stratagem, so that's kind of handy that that one's not been taken away. That was the primary one that most people were using their Hive Tyrants to farm out 2 copies of. For the Invasion Fleet at least, the Adrenal Surge is the other main option for 5+ critical hits. Occasionally flexing into a bit more damage and triggering those hyper adaptations might be worth it more, but I feel like the Feel No Pain's definitely going to remain the default. Otherwise though, the change will impact the Swarm Lord's Ruin a Stratagem type ability. That one can now only be used to increase the cost of battle tactics stratagems, not the rest of them. You can still use it to target the command point reroll, which might be one of the best targets for it now depending on what the opponent has, but you can't use it for other powerful stratagems like Overwatch or interrupting in combat. A bit of a nerf to the Swarm Lord and a small one to the Hive Tyrants, but as we'll see, it's kind of surprising that with that nerf coming that they've gone up as well. Otherwise though, the other things are maybe kind of small changes. The Overwatch alterations don't really affect them too much. Insane Bravery might be a little bit unhelpful if you desperately need one of your swarms to pass and it's out of synapse range. That's not something that you can fall back on anymore more than once per game. The change isn't really relevant for Shadowing the Warp, as you couldn't use Insane Bravery on it anyway. Finally, the towering change isn't really very relevant, besides unless they're fighting knights. Despite being fairly big, the new Norn Emissary is far from being on knight scale. Let's get into the points changes though, and it's kind of hard to know whether to compare them to the index points or the codex points that we basically never had. I think I'm broadly going to compare them to the codex points, though we'll make mention of both. The swarms have got kind of minimal changes. Gargoyles are back to 75 when there were 70 in the codex, though the best buff comes to Hormagaunts. They're down to just 65 points rather than 70 in the codex, and I feel like they're going to be quite a key unit for the unending swarm. They do basically gain the most from the detachment special rule in my opinion, certainly wanting to be closer to the enemy, though I guess Termagants with Spine Fists can be quite nice for that as well. Barbgaunts have seen another small increase. They were 50, then 55, now 60. Still kind of okay for infantry that pack a fairly punchy anti-infantry type special weapon, though a bit less standout once more. Genestealers are perhaps the other biggest winner from the lighter infantry type section. They're down to 85 from 95 in the codex or 90 in the index. I feel like the points drop is pretty reasonable for them, given that their rule isn't really quite as powerful at punching up against things with a big reroll wounds on units on objectives. I think at 85 points they're going to be a lot more playable, and that's quite a good change, particularly with some nice new models on the way. I think that's the sort of points cost where they're still going to be very interesting in Vanguard Onslaught. Otherwise, Ripper Swarms increased from 15 points to 20 points, which I guess is really quite a big proportion at Nerf. They've certainly got even worse for any sort of damage and defense you might want to do for them, but in reality they're still great value. 20 points for a single deep striking unit of any sort is lovely. They can pop up and do your secondary objectives where they need to, or just screen enemy deep strikers or get in the way of their units trying to move, and their job will be done. Muclids and Spore Mines both went up a little bit as well, but I don't think many people were ever going to pay points for them anyway, rather than just fire them out of Biovores. For heavier infantry, the Tyranid warriors revert back to their index cost, which is kind of good for the melee warriors, which were a bit weird that they went up in the codex. Both of them I think are probably a little bit on the overcosted side though compared with the competition. I feel like perhaps one of the biggest and heaviest nerfs that Tyranids are going to feel out of this update though are to Zoanthropes. They've gone up from 90 points all the way to 110 each. That really is a pretty painful nerf at plus 22%, and I think that's pretty meaningful for the competitiveness of the army overall, as they were a unit that it wasn't too uncommon to see 9 or more of in competitive lists from time to time. Biovores have had another fairly monumental increase. They were 65 points in the index or 45 in the codex. Now they're up at 75. Admittedly, since index times they have gained extra toughness, but at 75 points they're just really quite bad for their damage output. I feel they're well and truly being locked into the role where you probably only want one of them to fire Spore Mans around the board for screening, denying advances and secondary objectives, and then you probably don't want any more than that. Pyrovores remain pretty good I think at 30 points with their 5 wound profile now. Very good little units for disruption and potentially threatening a bit of Overwatch if needed. Hiveguard get a pretty weird update, going to 110 points from 95, so a big nerf there despite being kind of bad before. Really no idea what they were thinking there. They're a unit that could have gone down a bit and still not been particularly good. Von Schreine's Leapers are back to 75, so the same as the index, and Venomthropes and Raveners are unchanged. For the monsters, there are some that have had some meaningful updates, and then a bunch that have basically either been unchanged or gone back to index points costs. For the ones with more changes, the Tyrannifex is most certainly one of the ones that's been hit the hardest. This one's really quite a weird update. It was 200 in the index or 190 in the codex, but now despite an ability nerf where it's lost its -1 damage, it's now all the way up to 245 points. This one pretty much jumps straight from being a good Tyranid unit to being really quite a bad one. It was still feeling like a very maybe taken list versus things like Exocrines, Maliceptors and Haruspex, even when it was around about 200 points with the -1 damage. The Toxicring gets a medium-sized points decrease down to 180, though that's still not enough for it to be particularly interesting compared with the rest I think, just too specialised at killing infantry. The Norn Emissary and Assimilator both have very small points increases, 290 or 310. It's not really going to change much compared with the Codex. I think they still seem interesting enough for big bully monsters to stand on the midfield objectives and hopefully not die too fast with the 5+ feel no pain. The Harpy is 215, putting it cheaper than the Index, but more expensive than the Codex by a very long way. I think 165 in the Codex would have been fine, it wouldn't have been particularly strong even at that cost, which is 50 points less. The Maliceptor's seen a small increase up to 170, again still pretty reasonable though, with its fairly powerful shooting and 4+ invulnerable. The Screamer Killer's seen a very small points decrease down to 170, still a bit north of where it really needs to be though. And in Forge World lands, the Barbed and Scythe Hierodulls have gone up, perhaps mirroring the Tyrannifex, and the Harridans dropped down slightly to 610. Otherwise, for the other monsters out there, there's a lot of things that have just reverted back to their index points, or never left the index points from the first place. Carnifexes and Psychophages are 125, both kind of fine. The Trigon's 180 and the Morlock's 145. The Trigon I still think is playable with his rapid ingress type tricks. The Sporicist is very unfortunately back to 145 points, despite having a big nerf and losing its hive defense rule from the Codex. The Hive Crone's back at 200, the Tyrannocyte is back at 105, both a bit underwhelming, and the Haruspex and the Exocrine reversed the small points decrease that they got in the Codex, not as I think they really needed them anyway, to be fair. They're both very solid Tyranid monsters even before that, and I think compared with the rest weren't ones that really needed decreases. Finally, for characters, as mentioned, the Hive Tyrants have really had a bad time over this update. The Swarmlord went up to 270, so that's an 8% nerf compared with 250. As mentioned, I think that's a very weird change. I think it was fairly well balanced at 250 to be honest. More people tended to prefer the Walking Hive Tyrant on foot, and its debuff stratagem thing has got worse as well. Otherwise, the Hive Tyrant and the Winged one both went up around about 20 points, despite their free stratagems being more restrictive now. Admittedly, the standard Walking Hive Tyrant was seeing really quite a lot of play in competitive lists, perhaps more due to necessity and farming out the 5+ feel no pain more than anything else. He felt maybe a little bit more of a necessity as opposed to a really big feel good choice though. I feel like they were both kind of in a balanced sort of area though, and didn't really need the nerfs. Still probably playable, but definitely a lot less exciting than they were before. For the minimally changed characters, Old One Eye still fine at 140, so is the Neuro Tyrant at 105, and then the Broodlord, Turvigon and Winged Prime all keep their Codex decreases. Out of those three, I actually probably feel that the Winged Prime might be the single most exciting. I think he genuinely is quite cool for 65 points to add some skirmish threat to a Gargoyle unit, or could add the Vanguard Invader keywords to Warriors if you wanted to use them in the Onslaught formation. Finally, and perhaps some of the very biggest winners out of this entire Codex update, are the Lone Operatives. The Parasite and Mortrex I'd say is just merely okay at 80 points, a little bit more expensive than the Codex, but the Three Flavors of Lictors just seem absolutely outstanding now. Death Leaper drops yet another 5 points and is down to 70 points. Absolutely crazy for a Lone Operative with a 4+ invulnerable save, fights first, and plenty of other advantages. The Neurolictor remains at a very reasonably costed 65 points. He can be handing out a +1 to wounds to choice targets if you can make them fail with Shadow in the Warp potentially. And then the regular Lictor I think has decreased enough to make itself okay with the 5+ invulnerable save lost. That's all the way down to 60 points now, and it's just very very cheap overall. I think that's kind of fine without the invulnerable save, still to have a scary damage to fights first threat harassing the enemy. I'd say that all of those look great, borderline auto include for competitive lists. I feel like there might be an element of Games Workshop trying to encourage some sales there. Overall, I must admit it does feel like a bit of a weird update for the Tyranids, both because it's coming when the Codex contents are known but not officially released, and also just because of a few of the decisions they've made. For biggest winners from the Codex update, I feel like the Vanguard Onslaught things have done well. Genestealers and Lictors both look like they'll be staples in there now, and I do really like the Lictors and Death Leaper. Lots of the units that either got just points buffs reversed or minor nerfs that aren't going to hurt them too much are still good. The Haruspex, Exocrine and Maliceptor are all good staples I think. The Biovore I still think is probably basically auto-include even at 75 points, and the Carnifexes and Old One Eye didn't really change at all. They still look like they could do some heavy lifting. Otherwise, for winners I feel like the Hormagaunts at 65 points for a squad of 10 just got a lot more interesting for making the Unending Swarm work better. It's just less than 800 points for 120 of those rushing forward at you and moving closer every time they get shot. They definitely don't have the damage output to be dragging down any hard targets or anything, but they're going to thoroughly go up the board and then units are going to respawn when they die. you've still got quite a lot of a Tyranid army to play with, even after those things have gone charging in and securing the objectives for the first turn or two. Otherwise, for biggest losers though, I feel like I'd probably have to give it to the Tyranids and the Zoanthropes. Both of those are units that were really quite strong units for the Tyranids that have had very big nerfs. Zoanthropes, I'd say, are just a lot more middling now, probably take or leave, and the Tyranids is probably a bit worse than that, probably just don't take versus the other monsters. Otherwise, the Hive Tyrants and Swarm Lords have both come off second best, both points and rules nerfs at the same time. And then there's just the changes that are put in the bizarre decisions category. Hive Guard going up did not need to happen, nor did the Spore Assists, nor did the Harpies. All of those were absolutely fine where they were, in fact probably still needed further points decreases, not more nerfs. Overall, I feel like the update compared with the Codex Tyranid points is probably a small power nerf compared with what it would have been with the Codex points releasing. I have a feeling that that's probably not going to feel very exciting for Tyranids players, given that most of the reactions to the Codex points were that this seems kind of fine, nothing particularly overpowered, so getting things toned down from that position isn't great. I definitely don't think that Tyranids are competitively dead or anything from this though. A lot of their monsters remain good, Lictors and Friends look fun, though there definitely are a few units that are looking like they might be spending some time on the shelf for some people. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Codex Tyranids points updates. Look forward to hearing your opinions on the stuff that's been buffed or nerfed down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'll hope to cover a few more factions in a similar style to this for the balanced Dataslate updates. Otherwise, if you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's the way that I can keep on making videos like this quite so regularly. I do tend to make the effort to post a video every day under normal circumstances. If you've been finding any of these useful, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.